But if the interest rate goes up, if you're at a 1.05 debt service coverage ratio, you don't have enough cushion to make ends meet. You now have a failing project. Your debt service coverage ratio, when you go to get a loan from the bank, if it is not at least a 1.20, they will either deny the loan completely, or most often, they'll drop the amount they're willing to loan you until it hits a 1.20, and you have to come up in cash with the difference. So it has a huge impact on how much of a down payment you're required to bring in, whether or not they can qualify you for the loan in the first place, and it has an impact on your interest rate. The higher the risk of the loan, the higher the interest rate the bank, the credit union, the hard money lender are going to charge you.
Welcome to Real Estate to Freedom, the podcast that helps you create the active life you've always wanted through passive income investments. Now, here are your hosts, Dr. Nate and Becky Lambert.
Today, we're going to talk about a topic that some people find not as exciting, but actually, when you understand it, it makes a huge difference in your ability to qualify for commercial properties. If you want to buy a commercial project, the same metric actually will help you identify whether or not a long-term or a short-term rental property is viable. If it's working, it will help you manage your business. But most importantly, it helps you identify whether or not this project is a good one to purchase in the first place. It is one that banks look at. It's one of your biggest determinants on whether or not the bank approves you for a loan on the property. But it's also one that I see deal operators manipulate in a borderline dishonest way to make people think a project is better than it actually is. It's one that sometimes I see project operators who are trying to raise money for projects. I'll see them manipulate the numbers, and instead of showing you how it's performing historically, they'll show you what they project it to be after you put a bunch of money in. Do not fall for that trick, guys. You want to look at, this is called the debt service coverage ratio, and it is crucial. And we're going to walk you through what you should be looking at, how to evaluate it, and how to stress test your debt service coverage ratio, also known as a DSCR, how to stress test it so that you know not only is it working right now, but how likely is it to work in the future if interest rates go up or if vacancies increase or things like that. So I'm going to walk you through all of that today. I'm excited to have you with us today. I'm also excited to share with you just some of my experience having worked in banking for as long as I did. I worked on commercial projects for about 14, 15 years. Commercial real estate specifically was kind of my main focus. I'm going to walk you through some of the main things to know and evaluate on a deal, but then we're only going to dive in deep today on the debt service coverage ratio because this one's really crucial. And the more you understand it, A, the better an operator you look to the bank when you go apply for the commercial loan. B, the more experienced of an investor you are when people are trying to raise money from you on a commercial deal or on a residential deal. The more experience you have, the better you can tell them, yes, this is a good deal, or no, I'm not interested in putting my money in on this one. When you look at a commercial deal, you want to do your own due diligence first of all. Do not just trust the numbers that somebody gives to you, whether that's the seller or the deal operator, the capital raisers. You want to do as much of the due diligence on your own. We'll teach you how to do more of that on a future podcast, but you want to run your own comparables on the property. You want to look at market rents for the area, not just trust what numbers they gave you. This is just a synopsis of how to do your own due diligence. A very summarized, simplified version. We'll go in more in depth on a future podcast. You want to look at the current and the projected debt service coverage ratio. That's what we're going to dive into today. You want to know what the value add proposition is. So how are you going to improve this property? By improving the rents, improving the financial performance of the property. What is your value add? Otherwise, just know if you're buying this property without a value add, you're buying it at top dollar without any projections for the property to improve. If that's your goal and you're okay with the numbers the way they are, that's up to you. Most of us aim for a value add proposition because that's how you make money on the project. You need to know what your loan to value is and loan to cost. Again, that will be a future podcast talking about the difference and why they matter. And yes, banks look at both. And then you need to make sure you have two exit strategies. So if you're building homes to be sold, you need to make sure that you could rent them for enough money to cover your debt service coverage ratio, which we're teaching you today. Otherwise, you're banking on one exit strategy and one exit strategy only, and you're very determined. Your project could potentially be at risk if the market changes much. Your project is very much determined by your ability to sell those homes. That's not just on developing of homes. That is the same on office, retail, warehouse, multifamily properties, short-term rentals, long-term rentals. You need to make sure you have two exit strategies. I tell people whether they're flipping houses, same thing. Just because you can make money on the flip, maybe. If you can't rent it for enough money to cover the debt payment on the project, just know you're taking on a higher risk. And you need to make sure you're okay with that risk. For newer investors, I tell them make sure you have two exit strategies. Do not give on that one. If you're an experienced investor and you have plenty of money and the money you're putting into this project is money you won't even miss if you never get it back, then go ahead and take more risks if you're comfortable with that because you have outside income to make up the difference. That's where your risk threshold should be, is how much do I need this money to come back to me in order to cover my expenses in the future? Is this money that I have available to invest that I could lose and still be okay with? We really want to make sure that we are teaching you how to evaluate a deal correctly to protect yourself. There are lots of people out there who have deals. That doesn't make them all good deals. And just because someone tells you it's a good deal doesn't necessarily mean it is. So keep that in mind. Okay, we're going to dive deep into the debt service coverage ratio today. I know many of you have heard of this before because it's found in both residential and in commercial real estate. It's also one of those things that I hear people use a lot as real estate investors, but only approximately half of them have enough knowledge to truly understand what they're doing. A lot of them have just a basic understanding of a debt service coverage ratio, but not enough to really be useful to use it as a management tool. Many of them don't even know what the formula is. They've just heard other people using this phrase and they want to use it to sound smart. My goal is to not make you sound smart. It's to make you smart investors, savvy investors. Okay, so let's start with what is a debt service coverage ratio. A debt service coverage ratio in its most simplified form, you can get more in depth than this, but in its most simplified form is really a DSCR or debt service coverage ratio. It's really just a measurement of your project's ability to generate enough income to cover its debts. So it's the net operating income of the property divided by the total debt service requirement. That is your formula. Please write it down if you have something available to write it down on. We're going to come back to this multiple times, but this is a formula that you really should memorize. It's net operating income, or NOI, divided by P&I, or principal and interest, the required debt payments. And it's the same formula whether it's residential or commercial real estate. That formula changes if you're not in real estate. If you own like a business that sells widgets, that formula is different. So don't misinterpret that one. Reach out to me. I can teach you that one if you are considering buying a business. It's a little bit of a different formula. There's different computations that go into it on that one. But in real estate, it's really quite simple. Net operating income divided by debt service. On net operating income, the one thing I want to note to everybody is that your net income on this is all of your revenue from the property minus the expenses. What's left over is your net operating income. The one expense you do not include in that is debt payments. And I'll explain more why in just a minute. And actually, I'm going to pull up a table to kind of show you guys a simplified version. Let me hurry and share my screen on this. In real estate, it's a little bit more simplified than in other aspects of business management, which is quite handy for all of us, to be honest, because we have less that we have to worry about. But in real estate, it really is just your rents on the property minus your expenses. That is your NOI right there. Okay. I'm going to give you a more in-depth formula because this is not a more in-depth formula, but a more in-depth financial statement. I want you to be able to look at it. For those of you who are listening to us online only or listening to us through the podcast format, I'm going to walk you through the numbers that are on the screen that everybody else is able to view, or you can review this podcast and watch it on YouTube as well, where you can see the video itself. Most of the time, I'll try to walk you through. This is a more complicated financial statement, but I wanted one that was real estate specific rather than a company that sells widgets, because the numbers are going to be different and the line items you're going to see are different. For those of us that are real estate investors, you're going to have your income on the property. So that's the total amount of rents. On a multifamily space, you'll usually see a number called vacancy, or you'll have a column for vacancy and then a negative number. What that means is they're trying to show you how much the property could potentially make in rents. But because there's almost always going to be a vacancy somewhere, especially on a large apartment project, you're going to have a vacancy of a 1 month turnover here or there in various units. So that's how much they didn't make because of vacancies during the period of the year. And then what you have below that is your effective gross income, the money that's left over. Concessions, you don't need to worry too much about that. That's like loss of lease, your bad debt, things like that. Agreements you made on concessions to get them to move in. So like a reduced rent for the first year, things like that. Don't worry too much about the negative numbers. Ultimately, effective gross rent here is just how much money the project actually made. A lot of times you'll see it this way on a commercial project. Sometimes your accountant will just show you rents with the number out there. Both of them are correct. It's the actual amount of money you made that you're looking at. Other income on multifamily, don't stress too much about that, but a lot of times that's going to be like pet rent, media fees for like internet, things like that, reserved parking spaces or covered parking spaces, laundry room, income, just a variety of different income sources on multifamily. Oh, let me go back up one. Don't worry about those numbers because that is not necessarily crucial. What we're looking at here is the net actual income on the project, including your other income. Most multifamily projects do have other income. If you find a multifamily project that doesn't have other income, just know that you've got a potential way to raise money on the project, get additional income. If the tenants are contracting for their own internet, if the tenants are going outside of the project to get for laundromats to wash their laundry, if you've got places you could put in covered parking in a place that's desirable, know that those are all potential ways you can raise the income on the project, but we're not going to dive too much into that. So your net income minus your expenses. You'll notice here on this real estate financial statement, the expenses on a multifamily project usually include things like your payroll, your legal, your contract fees, marketing expenses, your utilities, your property taxes, your insurance, a management company to manage the project. In this financial, it says turnover fee, which would be the same as repairs and maintenance. So like a tenant moves out, you put in new carpet or you touch up the paint. All the expenses needed to turn over the unit, also classified as repairs and maintenance, or sometimes listed as CapEx. CapEx is usually more in depth than that. That's like your roof, your main items that you set aside money to cover. That's usually what people call CapEx. I've seen it classified multiple different directions, but ultimately that's the main items. Those are your main expenses that are going to be on a rental property, whether it's a single family home or a multifamily project. Usually you'll have pretty close to the same expenses. On this financial, they show a deposit to replacement reserves. That is not actually an expense. That is like a savings account, basically. They're putting money aside to help replace the roof when it needs to be done, or to replace the hot water heaters or the HVAC systems like your air conditioning, your heater, things like that. So if I were going to go in depth on this one, I would remove that line item for deposit to replacement reserves because it is not a cash expense. It is a savings account, and that's not money they have spent yet. However, just for simplification on this analysis, we're going to assume that that's a different expense, legal fees, whatever you want to call it, just so we can see your total expenses. On this one, you have net income of $5,443,000 with expenses of $2,948,000. I'm rounding numbers to make it simple here. Notice the debt payment is not included in there. Let me walk through why. This is standard in all accounting financials. Your debt payment is a below the line item, below your net operating income, because if you sell the property to someone else, they're not going to have the same debt terms. This is the reason it is excluded always, or should be. So for example, if I bought a property and I paid all cash for it, it might look like the property is performing really well. But if I sell it to my friend Becca, Becca's probably going to take out a loan to buy the property. So it's not going to perform exactly the same for her. And quite frankly, if I bought it in all cash, that doesn't necessarily make it a smart investment. Just because it's generating cash doesn't mean it's a good cash on cash return. We'll go through that one in a future podcast as well. But typically in real estate, you don't want to be over levered because you want to take out some of the risk. But if you put too much cash in there just to make it work, what that means is you bought a bad property. It doesn't cash flow. It's not a good investment. There's a fine line between the two. We'll teach you how to identify it in both cases. On this particular property, we see that the total debt service coverage payments per year, or the debt service payments, is $1,820,000 per year, based on our net operating income of $2,494,000 and a debt service payment of $1,820,000. So you're going to divide those two numbers, your NOI of roughly 2.5 million divided by your debt service of 1.82 million, which gives you a debt service coverage ratio of a 1.10. For those of you who are looking at the slide, you'll notice I have that highlighted in red. That's because that's not good. That's not a very good debt service coverage ratio. Ideally, you really want a 1.3 or higher. That's like your best projects. Most banks will not lend on the project unless it is a 1.25 or higher. There are a few that will go down to a 1.2, but they're kind of few and far between. So plan on a 1.25, aim for a 1.3. Anything between above a 1.2 is a pretty good project. Anything below that is a risky project, a little bit more risky. If it's below a 1.0, guys, what that means is it doesn't even make enough money to cover its own debt. It means it is going to be a cash drain on your personal finances that you will have to be feeding each month until the project is cash flowing. Now, in this particular project, this is actually one we did in fact invest in. And you might think, well, why would you invest in it if it's a 1.10? Well, what I want to show you on this financial statement, for those of you who are online, I'll describe it to you. The first column says year one. This is actually not the historical operating financial on the property. This is what their projection is for year one. If I included the number on here, which that one was a bigger number, so it's harder to see. If I showed you the actual historical operating financial, it's operating currently at a 1.32 debt coverage ratio, which is a really good coverage ratio. We're projecting it to drop down in year one, which sounds scary, but actually, if you are buying multifamily, for the most part, if you're doing it right, this is pretty common. The goal is to buy the property if it's below market rents and then raise rents until they hit market rents. Naturally, if you walk into an apartment building, approximately a third of them are going to have leases that expire in the first 4 months because most of them are 12-month leases. You'll have a handful that are already on month-to-month leases. Your goal is to go in and raise rents, maybe not all the way to market rents quite yet because you don't want a ton of people moving out, but you want to raise them enough that you have some people who agree to pay the higher amount and some that move out to try to find something different, in which case you can replace those spaces with a higher rent space. And then each year at renewal, you want to be raising the rents on those spaces until you get them all to market rents. You can remodel the ones that the people move out, get top dollar on them, or get closer to top dollar, but it's kind of a juggling act on how far to raise the rents. You can't just go in and raise them all immediately. You have to honor the contracts that are in place. So this one is projected to be below a 1.20 debt coverage ratio in the first year because of the projected number of tenants that are going to move out immediately. And then the vacancy in those units while they're being remodeled, which will then bring us to year two at the higher rent rates, which you'll see from this spreadsheet that they're projecting that rents will go up by about $100 a month after the remodel, which is very conservative for this particular market area. In Nate and I's analysis, the market rents in this particular area were closer to about $11.50 right off the bat. So this is still below market rents. And by comparisons, the projects right across the street and right next door to this one were at $11.50, and they're literally neighboring apartment buildings. And they are not drastically nicer than this particular project. So it's very, very feasible. So on this particular project, you'll notice that by raising rents slowly, it's expected to reduce income in year one, but then increase the debt coverage ratio in year two to 1.55. That's very normal in multifamily. It's okay to have a year where you're projecting to have a debt coverage ratio below where you want it to be, as long as you can identify why it's lower. And what's the game plan? Is this all part of the game plan? If it goes below a 1.0, you need to know in advance as much as possible so you have time to come up with the money to cover the difference. But it's not necessarily always a bad thing either if it goes below a 1.0 temporarily. But remember, most projects that fail don't fail because they're a bad project. It's because they ran out of cash. Did you hear that? In real estate, we say cash is king. A lot of projects fail because they run out of cash to make the payroll expenses and pay the management company and pay the utilities. But they're in the process of getting to a better position. A lot of times projects like this is where they have a problem. They just run out of cash to make the payments, and so they sell it to somebody else who has enough cash reserves to make the payments, fix up the property, raise the rents, and make it a performing property. That is exactly what we did on this particular project. And I'm not trying to sell you on that project. I just wanted to walk you through kind of how that pans out typically in real estate and why that actually matters. The projected debt service coverage ratio is a super crucial investment tool for investors because it helps you to identify when you are likely to have a cash shortage and how much it's likely to be so that you can plan and budget for your particular project. I'm going to go back to screen sharing one more time because I want to show you this actual project, the debt service coverage ratio on a simplified form. So let me jump back in here. Okay, so you'll notice from this actually includes the historical financials on that exact project. And I use the same project because it helps you see longevity on a project, you'll see that it is performing or was at a 1.2 right before we bought it. That's based on the 12 months, the trailing 12 months of financials. On the year one, it's projected to drop down to between a 1.10, 1.12, depending on what debt service coverage ratio you use. Year two, it goes up. Year three, it goes up, and so on and so forth. Okay, one word to make you wiser as an investor. Actually, more than one word by definition. What I often see, a big mistake I see people make frequently for new investors especially, is they'll look at the project and they'll say, okay, the bank is giving me 18 months of interest only. And then they'll run all 10 years of projected financials at the interest only payment that they only have for 18 months. Guys, you are not doing yourself a favor by assuming that you will be on interest only forever, because you won't. The Federal Reserve will come down on those banks and take them over. The banks are only allowed to do an interest only period during the period in which your contractor claims that they are remodeling the project. It's reserved for like a construction and leasing up period. But they are required by federal laws, banking laws, that's banks and credit unions, by the way, same rules. They are required to have an amortizing loan once you get past that leasing up period. You can oftentimes, on a larger project, talk them into 2 or 3 years of interest only, because it does take quite a while to turn over those tenants and get the leases up to full scale, but it cannot be indefinite. You need to be running these debt service coverage ratios as if the loan is on amortizing payments. It's good to know what it is on interest only, so that if you have a low period like we have in year one, we know how low it's actually going to be in that period, or most likely going to be, knowing that they are still projections. Sometimes there are expenses you're not expecting, but be as conservative as you can on your projections, because it's always awesome when your project outperforms what you're projecting. But when it underperforms and you aren't prepared for that and you don't have the cash for it, that can put you into a very, very difficult financial position. So yeah, know what your actual payments are, but run a sensitivity analysis, which I'll go through further in depth a little bit later in this presentation. Run a sensitivity analysis and know what the payments are when it's on amortizing payments, and know how long that loan is fixed for, and how likely you are to be able to make the payments if interest rates change. Because let me tell you a little secret, interest rates do change. Hopefully they change in your favor, but they don't always. And you cannot assume that it will always be in your favor. There are plenty of situations where it's just not, and you have to be able to adjust and plan out your project in a cash flow position where you may not have the income that you were hoping for. Okay, the next thing I want to walk you through is a little bit some of the lessons I have learned in commercial real estate over about 21 years of commercial real estate. Lessons I've learned, mistakes I've seen people make on debt service coverage ratios. We just did the simplified analysis of what is a debt service coverage ratio. I showed you some financials of how to calculate it. I really encourage you guys to use this metric and measure all of your current properties. And any property you're looking at buying, measure it. You want at least a 1.25. That's a minimum. If anything is below a 1.0, if it's below a 1.0 right now when you're buying it, what that means is you're overpaying for the project. So either walk away or negotiate a lower price, but don't overpay for it. This is a mistake I see a lot of rookie investors make. It's almost painful how often sellers will manipulate a rookie investor and make them feel like this is what everybody does. And then I'll translate it to you in the residential space, and you'll realize how comical this actually sounds. So they'll reach out, like the seller will be trying to sell a property, and obviously they want top dollar because everybody does. They'll tell you, well, look, market rents in this area are $1,200 a month, and this project's doing really well. It hasn't fully turned around yet, but it's doing great. And they'll try to sell it to you at a cap rate, assuming that it's all renting at $1,250 a month, even though they're actually only getting $1,100 a month on the property. And even if you can verify the numbers that the market rents are $1,250, that does not mean you should be paying what it would be worth if it was rented at $1,250, because you still have to put in the work of turning over the rents to the higher amount. And markets change, economies change. Sometimes it's harder to fill a space than you might think. You do not pay them based on what the project is likely to perform at. You pay them, the seller, based on what it's performing at right now. That's why the financials are so crucial. That's why when you buy a property, you need to get historical operating financials. You need to evaluate those financial statements, look for how timely the financials are and how the quality of the financials are. High quality financial statements should give you a lot more confidence than ones that look like someone didn't know what they were doing, just put numbers together. Let me translate that to you in the residential side, and you'll see just how real this is. I find rookie commercial investors fall for that often. It's really quite painful to see it. So don't let someone make you think that this is what they always sell for in the commercial space. They're lying to you because they want the highest top dollar. That would be the equivalent of me selling a property that needs a lot of work. It hasn't been updated in the last 60 years and it's not renting at top dollar, but I'm going to turn around and sell it to you at top dollar as if it's fully remodeled already. It doesn't make any sense, right? I should sell my property based on what it's worth right now in its current condition, not for after you put 50,000 of remodel into it, what's it worth at that point? There's no cushion for you to make money. You still have to pay the 50,000 to get it to that top value, and now it's only worth what you paid for it. Plus but you already paid 50,000 more, so you're negative on the equity on the project. That's the same way on commercial space. So don't let people talk you into paying for a property based on what the market rents are. It's based on historical financials only. I also see people try to shorten that window and say, well, now I've got all the rents raised to $12.50 a month. They've only been in place for a month or two. So we're going to take that $12.50 a month and times it by 12, assuming that that's the income for the next 12 months, and that's what you're going to pay me for it. Well, no, it's based on the trailing 12. A T12 is what they call that. The last 12 months of financials. So if you raise the rents last month or the month before, there's no guarantee they're going to stay at that. I pay you based on the trailing 12. And people think, well, that's not fair. They're already at $12.50 a month. Let me tell you what I have seen happen way more often than I would like to admit. A new investor comes in, he or she buys the project based on the $12.50 a month rents that are in the project right now. The trailing 12 showed $1,100 on the property, but the last 2 or 3 months they've had the $12.50 a month. The investor pays as if they're all at $12.50 for 12 months what the net operating income would be, because that actually is what determines the value of the property, is the net income for the last 12 months. So they overpay for the project up front. And then they call me frustrated. They're like, I don't know what's going on, but my tenants are not paying rent. Like 40% of them aren't paying and I have to keep collecting every month. What happened? Well, when you dive in deep, you find out that said seller wanted to get top dollar for the property. So he or she moved in a whole bunch of people who really can't qualify to make a $12.50 monthly payment. They don't have enough income. Or even worse, I've seen it where they actually pulled homeless people off the street and stuck them in there. The sellers paid the money themselves to make it look like they were paying rent, and the homeless people have to be kicked out. So now, not only did you overpay for the project, but you now have to evict a whole bunch of people who should never have been moved in the first place. That's almost worse than overpaying for it, because now you overpaid for it and you have a pretty big expense. And unfortunately, a decent amount of them do damage the property because they're mad that they're being kicked out. You want a project that has at least, you're basing it on the last 12 months. If those tenants have been in there for 9, 10, 11 months and they've made the payments every month, you're a lot safer than if they've only been in there for 1 or 2 months. So a lot of people can come up with $12.50 for 1 or 2 months, even if they're only making $900 a month in their job. That doesn't mean they can make it long term. So the protection for you from the qualifications that the previous owner used to vet people in there is how long they've been paying it. You can get a copy of the lease. Most of them will not give you copies of the credit reports and background checks because a lot of properties don't pull them, and it's not commonplace to share that. That's why investors use the trailing 12. Protect yourself and stick with the trailing 12. Do not let anyone talk you into something otherwise. This is for your protection. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk about why the debt service coverage matters for you as the investor, and then we'll talk about why it matters for the lender. Your debt service coverage ratio, first of all, is a risk tolerance measurement for you. This tells you how much of a cushion you have after you make the debt on the payment for the property, the debt payments on the property, how much of a cushion you have to cover for other expenses. The new roof, the new furnace, the new AC, whatever expenses you have coming in. How much of a cushion do you have? How much of a cash flow do you have? As any even remotely experienced investor out there can tell you, if I am barely making enough money to make the debt payments on the project and I'm only taking home, say, $10 a month in cash flow, that's not a good project because you'll only take home $10 a month once or twice, and then you'll have a $300, $400, $4,000 expense, depending on how big the project is. That cushion is crucial to help you stay afloat. It's not about being greedy and wanting more money on your more profits on your property, although we all do want more profits. It's about having enough money set aside in savings for your capital expenditures. We call that CapEx. short for capital expenditures. The repairs on the property that are inevitably going to be there. When you rent out a property, damage just happens. I mean, let's be honest, even my house, well, actually, I have 8 kids. Mine's probably more than average. For somebody who doesn't have 8 kids, there's still going to be damage to the house that needs to be repaired, a lock here or there, or something that's broken here or there. Our house has a little bit more than average because we have 6 boys and 2 girls, aside from my husband and I. So our contractor's a frequent in our household, but that's okay. We love him for it. So your DSCR tells you how much of a cushion you have to make your debt obligations and to cover other expenses that are unexpected. It helps you with cash flow planning. It allows you to identify when you're likely to have a shortfall, how much it's going to be, and make plans accordingly. I would way rather know that 6 months in advance than to find out 6 minutes in advance of when I need to come up with the money. The further in advance you have, the more likely you are to succeed and to find a solution. Because as you know, loans take time, finding an option takes time. So cash flow planning is crucial. It gives you a high amount of confidence as an investor that this is a project that's going to work long term. One of the other things it does when you have a higher debt service coverage ratio is it gives you a cushion so that if interest rates go up, you still have a bit of a window that you're okay. If you're at a 1.0 and your interest rate goes up, you're host. You've got nothing to cover that except your personal outside income. The last thing it does is it helps with loan approval. Not just helps, I would argue it is one of the most crucial determinants of whether or not you could get the loan approved when you buy the project or when you go to refinance the project. Commercial loans, guys, they are not like your primary residence. You buy a house and your interest rate is fixed for 30 years and you live in it. And if you live in it for a year and one day, you can rent it out and buy another house and do it again. That's called house hacking. We'll teach you that one. Actually, Nate will teach you that on his podcast that specializes in residential real estate. I'm focusing just on commercial because that's really where my most valuable experience is that I can teach you. But on a commercial property, your debt service coverage ratio is huge. And commercial loans, very rarely will you get a commercial loan that has an interest rate that's fixed for longer than 10 years. As a matter of fact, I would say the majority of them are 5 years or less, usually 5. Or you'll have like a 10-year loan, but the rate readjusts at the end of the 5-year period. So you don't have to renew the loan, but the interest rate will adjust either up or down. If the interest rate goes down, we all cheer. That's awesome. But if the interest rate goes up, if you're at a 1.05 debt service coverage ratio, you don't have enough cushion to make ends meet. You now have a failing project. And it was working just fine before, but interest rates went up. But the truth is it wasn't working just fine before. That's why it was a 1.05. That's one of the reasons we have a cushion there in the middle. Your debt service coverage ratio, when you go to get a loan from the bank, if it is not at least a 1.20, they will either deny the loan completely, or most often they'll drop the amount they're willing to loan you until it hits a 1.20 and you have to come up in cash with the difference. So it has a huge impact on how much of a down payment you're required to bring in, whether or not they can qualify you for the loan in the first place, and it has an impact on your interest rate. The higher the risk of the loan, the higher the interest rate the bank, the credit union, the hard money lender are going to charge you. By the way, if you're buying a commercial property, you shouldn't be buying it with a hard money lender because when you use a hard money lender to buy a single family home to fix and flip it, you can use that loan for a few months, get it back on the market and get it sold. On a commercial property to actually raise rents, it usually takes a minimum of 12 months, typically anywhere from 24 to 36 months to really raise the rents all the way. A hard money loan for 3 years will really eat up your profits pretty fast. So just know that they are not common. They should very, very rarely be used in a commercial space for this very reason. If you are going to use one, make sure you have an end result. You know when it's going to happen and you know how much you're going to be paying on interest on a hard money loan. But the better your debt service coverage ratio, the lower your interest rate on the project, which therefore improves your debt service coverage ratio, improves your cash flow on the project. For that reason, you really, really want to watch your debt service coverage ratio. As such, well, how do I make my debt service coverage ratio better? Well, there's only a handful of things you can do, so it's not that complicated. One is you increase the rents on the project or the rental income. So other income, like we talked about, media packages, reserved parking spaces, things like that. You raise the income on the project in one way or another. You improve your vacancy rate, which again raises your rental income on the project. You can reduce your operating expenses or your maintenance expenses. So figure out if you've got any duplication. Do you really need an office manager and a showing agent, or can you have one person who does both, depending on the size of the project? Do you need a full-time maintenance person, or can you just hire someone that comes in and fixes it as needed, depending on the size of the project. Things like that, kind of figure out where you can save on your expenses, raise rents, lower expenses, or improve your loan terms, which ironically occur as you have a better DSCR. So that's why it matters. But if you can extend the amortization of your loan, as a lender, I've successfully got it approved multiple times to go from a 30-year amortization to a 40-year, which drops the monthly payment and makes the debt service coverage ratio better. That would be determined on the remaining useful life of the project and how much the bank really likes the guarantors. The more outside income you have, the more likely they are to be flexible with you on things like that. But if you can extend the loan amortization period, if you can lower the interest rate on the project, the only other way to improve it would be to lower your loan amount, which therefore requires you to put more cash in or negotiate a lower purchase price. So run your measures based on those options, see where that goes. Okay, the last few things I want to talk about, this is called stress testing. I'm going to pull up a table I want to show everybody on how to stress test your project itself. There are some things that really, really matter on stress testing. We provide our clients a table that allows them to identify how well a property is doing. And the reason we provide this to our clients is we want them to be able to analyze the project. So let me hurry and share my screen here. We want to teach everyone how to actually analyze it well. This is just a template that I use to help our investors know how to run numbers on a commercial project. For those of you who are online only or listening through podcast, there's a table that shows your debt service coverage ratio and how to compute it. And then it computes in there your cash flow on the project and your projected cash flow based on the return of investment per year. Because your return on investment, the typical number you look at is not just the cash flow per year, it's also how much money you're projected to make when you sell the project. It is healthy and good, though, to look at year by year by year and then how much of the chunk is at the end. Because if people think they're investing in a project that's going to get a 15% rate of return, and the truth is they don't get that 15% until they sell the project, they're only getting a 3% rate of return each year, they can be disappointed thinking they're making more money or they were counting on that money to cash flow something else or a different expense somewhere else. So you got to know not just how much money you're likely to make, but when the timing of that money. Okay, so this table right here, this is a debt service coverage interest rate sensitivity analysis. You should do a sensitivity analysis on the interest rate and on a variety of other features, like if rents were to go down or expenses were to go up. Looking at your market area, if the project is at market rents, you need to kind of sensitize it as if market rents went down a little bit. If you're below market rents, then you're probably safe. You've got a cushion there. But if your expenses are currently below market expenses, well, then you should plan on them being market expenses. There's a reason why they're lower than market, and usually typically that's because the seller's lying or not including expenses, or because the seller's just not maintaining the property at all. That's why yours is below. That's not a good sign. You're going to have to come in and do that maintenance. So don't overpay for that based on expenses. Know the expense ratio averages in your area. So if you go to buy a commercial multifamily property and the seller says their expense ratio is 20%, first of all, you should know enough to call bull on that. That's not true. Across the nation, average is about 40%. Some markets are 50 or even 60% of rents. So if you're anywhere below 40%, it's probably not accurate. Or it could be that it's because they're self-managing it and they're not paying themselves any money. That's cool if you like to manage a project and not get paid for it. I happen to think my time is valuable and I'm not going to do that. I want to hire a property manager to do it so that I can focus on finding deals. Okay, so we have rent, we have expenses and NOI. And then I put in this table in the yellow what the annual debt payment is going to be on the project if I have an interest rate of 5%. The next line down is 5.5%, 6%, 6.5%, so that I can compute what's the debt service coverage ratio and what is the cash flow in each of these scenarios. So if I'm buying a project and the bank says I'm going to have a loan of 5%, if I know this 5% interest rate's only fixed for 12 months or 24 months, you need to know what happens if this goes up. On this project, I stress test it for a 1.5% interest rate increase, just for the interest of space. You can always amend that table and go up by 1% on each line and go 4% if you're starting with a really low interest rate and you know it's going to go up. Those are called adjustable rate mortgages, and be careful with those. They have a place, a very important place. But I would say I've seen more investors get into trouble because of an adjustable rate mortgage than anything else. Because typically when the market's offering an adjustable rate mortgage, this is not on a primary residence, guys, this is on commercial, but it happens both ways. Typically, when the market's offering an adjustable rate mortgage, I see investors suddenly forget what that means and way overpay on projects, assuming that their interest rate's always going to be low, even though they happen to know it's only fixed for 18 months. You cannot assume interest rates are going to go down at the end of that period. You have to assume they're going to go up so that if they do, you're not bankrupt. If they happen to go down, hurrah, you're making more money. I will celebrate with you, but don't shoot yourself in the foot under an assumption that hasn't taken place yet. So stress test it for 1.5 to 2% increase from where you are currently, especially if you're in an ARM adjustable rate mortgage that's below the market rate. You want to stress test it to at or above the current market interest rates. Oftentimes I'll go 1 to 1.5% higher than that as well. So just kind of know that's what that's for. The DSCR tells us what the debt service coverage ratio is going to be in each of those scenarios as the interest rate sensitivity analysis goes up. And then cash flow tells you what your cash flow is going to be. Because if you start seeing negative numbers in there, that's a pretty quick flag that, oh, there's a problem here. If it's negative by $50, okay, I can handle $50 a year. What if it's negative by 50,000 or 150,000? That's a bit more painful. I want to know that in advance and strategically decide whether or not I want to do this, be involved in this project. Your debt service coverage ratio is a strong indicator of whether or not this project works. It is a great way for you to identify whether or not you should invest in this project. It does not mean that you should always deny anything that's below a 1.25. You'll notice from the example I showed you, we are projecting in the first year after we buy it that it will go down to a 1.10. That's still above a 1.0, so we're not projecting cash a shortage, although there might be a little bit of one, and we have about $800,000 set aside as a reserve in case that happens, so we should be okay on that. But just know, I'm okay with it because I understand why it's going to go down. Rents go down when you start raising rents because sometimes some of the tenants will just naturally move out. That's totally normal. But know that you have an end game plan. If you're projecting the cash or the debt service coverage ratio to be a 1.20 at purchase, and then a 1.1 in year one, and a 1.05, and then a 1.0, and then a 0.95, figure out why it's going down and what you're going to do to correct that before it hits negative, why that's a problem. So a debt service coverage ratio is a management tool. This is not just a box we check to send the bank so the bank can make a decision on it. This is a crucial project management tool that will help you identify whether or not this is a good project, what your cash flow shortage is likely to be and when, and helps you identify what you need to do to correct that so that you can keep your property in a good financial position as long as possible. It's a good management tool to help you identify deals in a better manner and also to get better financing. It also helps you avoid financial strain like we talked about. So do not underestimate the power of a debt service coverage ratio. The more you understand this number and know how to compute it, the better off as an investor you will be. The point is to help you become independent on your own and know how to do this on your own.
Thanks for listening to Real Estate to Freedom with Dr. Nate and Becky Lambert. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can download their free ebooks and workshops by visiting realestatetoFreedom.com.